Welcome and thank you for standing by. Currently, all participants are in our listen-only mode. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted publicly. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I'd like to turn the call over to your host for today, Erlene Dow.
Thank you, Lisa. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. We will save all our questions to the end of the presentation. Please add all your questions to the Q&A box and we will read them out loud during the Q&A session. The chat is disabled to our attendees at this time. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the April Local Employment Dynamics, or LED webinar. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the LED Partnership, in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome Tim O'Neill as he presents Minnesota's aging workforce and how it compares to other states using census data. U.S. Census Bureau's quarterly workforce indicators, or QWI, along with other resources, allows economists to track Minnesota's aging workforce over several decades. This trend will continue to be seen as the baby boomer generation continues to age unless there is an increase in immigration or an unlikely increase in birth rate. The following presentation is based on a recent article that reveals how Minnesota's share of older workers has shifted in recent history, as well as how this aging compares with other states and the nation. Tim O'Neill is the Department of Economic Employment Development's, or DEED, regional analyst for the 7-county Twin Cities region of Minnesota. He has a bachelor's degree in history and political science from St. Olaf College in Northfield and a master's degree in public policy from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. With that, I welcome Tim.
Thank you, Erlene, and thank you, Lisa, and thank you everybody for being here today for this webinar hosted by the U.S. Census Bureau and Local Employment Dynamics Partnership in collaboration with C2ER and the LMI Institute. I very much appreciate the time given for being able to present today, looking at a lot of data. So I've got a lot of data coming your way. There's going to be a lot of charts and graphs and figures and tables, so get excited for those. We actually got a really nice summary from Erlene just now. But I'll go into more of the details, more of the statistics and the trends and what we're seeing for an aging workforce in the state of Minnesota, and again, how it compares to other states in the nation across the United States. So my name is, again, Tim O'Neill, and I work with the Department of Employment and Economic Development, or DEED. So you can read all about DEED in this little blurb here. I won't stay too long in this slide, but feel free to check out DEED's resources and how we utilize census data and data from the quarterly workforce indicators, for instance, through our website at mn.gov/DEED. The Labor Market Information Office with DEED that I work within, we're a small but mighty part of the Department of Employment and Economic Development. Kudos to all those other analysts that I work with. They're the ones that are constantly collecting information, of course, through censuses, through surveys, through administrative data, on everything from labor force trends and statistics to industry trends and statistics, occupational wages, educational data, projections. So there's just a lot of information that we can look into. And when we're looking into this quarterly workforce indicators data through the QWI Explorer tool or application, it's actually really eye-opening. And I think this is one of the big takeaways of my presentation, just looking at how can we see these statistics, these trends, looking into the data through a resource like the QWI Explorer tool, and how does it relate to all this other data that we have available through the Labor Market Information Office? And that could be similar for if you're working in other state labor market information offices, or if you're working through C2ER or the LMI Institute, the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, or if you're just curious about what's happening in the labor market, what's happening in our economies, what's happening with aging across the population of the United States and the individual states, local areas, digging down into workforce service areas, digging down into counties, and just seeing the trends over time. And I know many of you are well aware of, as well as our office, we've been looking into aging trends. We've been looking into that for population. We've been looking into that for the workforce for a long time. We've known that this has been coming for a long time, especially when we're looking at the very large baby boomer generation within the United States. And so for us within the state of Minnesota, looking at those born between 1946 and 1964, and just how that has shifted in the labor force, in this case in the state of Minnesota, through 2000, through 2010, through 2020. And then we can also, with this quarterly workforce indicators data, start to look into how these age cohorts have shifted in the labor market through 2022, through the second quarter of 2022. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Here's just a couple of faces of the Labor Market Information Office. You can see my lovely face on the center right. So I cover the 7-county metro area, including the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul within the state of Minnesota. We also have labor market analysts that are constantly looking into data like this through the quarterly workforce indicators or through the Census Bureau, just to add on to the data that we use through our Labor Market Information Office to provide that understanding, to provide that context, that information versus data. We could have conversations about that for a long time, but that information to apply that understanding for all stakeholders, whether you're students, job seekers and career seekers, educators, economic development agencies, local, state or federal government, workforce boards, so on and so forth. So I think one of the great things about this data through the quarterly workforce indicators, along with all this other data, I'm being a little redundant now, but it's just to provide that greater understanding so that everybody can make better, more informed decisions in whatever endeavors that they're doing. So you can see some of the leadership then for our office on the left too. So I'll just make a quick remark. Angelina Wen, our LMI director, Orion Casal, our LMI assistant director, and a little shout out for Alessia Liebert. She's one of our research project managers, and she has some pretty cool research that she has done on job mobility, which is highly related to this aging trend and diversity trends that we're also seeing in the state of Minnesota. So yeah, your screens weren't frozen. Moving forward, this is the Quarterly Workforce Explorer data tool, looking at quarterly workforce indicators data. And this is just a couple of bullet points looking at what are we talking about here with this data. I'm sure many of you listening in today are well aware of this data tool and the power that it has and the data that it has and the understanding that we can get from this type of data and the analysis that we can do. But for those of you that are unfamiliar, check out that URL link there. If you need to zone out or anything like that during this presentation, I'll just assume that you're checking out the QWI Explorer tool. Just quickly, it's just qwiexplorer.ces.census.gov. So you can check out and have a great time with the rest of the week here looking up all this data that's available. But you can see just a quick blurb here on my second bullet point that this information is coming from a whole host of different sources, including unemployment insurance UI earnings data, quarterly census of employment and wages data, business dynamic statistics, American Community Survey data to look into the demographics, as well as Social Security administrative records and more. And with this data, the great thing about when you're looking into, just plugs left and right for the QW Explorer, but when you're looking into this data, you can get a really good understanding for trends, for employment trends. You can look at hiring, you can look at separations, you can look at turnover, you can look at earnings data, and you can break all of that down by age, race and ethnicity, gender, and educational attainment. So for the study here today, we were looking at trends in the state of Minnesota, specifically looking at aging between 1995 and 2020. And then specifically looking at beginning of quarter employment counts. So this is going to be similar to looking at point in time kind of data, similar to the quarterly census of employment and wages. The great thing about this, then again, I'll be a little bit more redundant, is that you can take all of this demographic data and look at the United States for private ownership, and then you can look at total employment too, as well as private ownership for state level data, as well as workforce service areas, as well as counties. So this is just a quick screenshot of what you're going to get yourself into when you visit the Quarterly Workforce Indicators or QWI Explorer tool. I didn't want to break up my lovely PowerPoint deck here by switching between the slides and going online. So yeah, I just thought I would throw in a couple of screenshots to show what this tool looks like when you go to it. Again, at qwiexplorer.ces.census.gov. And so you can see just looking across this screen here that you can switch between the states in the upper left. You can switch between the different indicators. Here you can see I was again looking at employment, beginning of quarter employment counts. And then just kind of scanning across the screen here, you can see that you can look at filters and aggregations, talking about all those different indicators that I mentioned before, like hiring, separations, turnover, earnings, so on and so forth, and the worker characteristics, such as age, race and ethnicity, educational attainment, and gender. And then you can switch up, for instance, with the x-axis and the group, the drop-down menus there. If you're looking under the group drop-down menu, I'll just say there's a quick and cool analysis you can do where you're looking at the NAICS codes, so the North American Industry Classification System. You can default to the 20 major industry sectors, or you can zoom in on the 3-digit, more in-depth industries, or even the 4-digit NAICS, really in-depth industries. And then you can look at those worker characteristics, and you can download, export it into Excel. You can look at it just through this interactive tool up front, and you can just have a lot of, I suppose, fun if you're really into the statistics or understanding, and some really cool trends analysis that you can do with this tool. My one takeaway, when I do this when I talk about our labor market information tools and resources, and I think it goes for this as well with the QWI Explorer. When you're at it, keep your eye out for blue links and tabs. It's just, I suppose, just in the data world, we love blue links and tabs for data applications. So there's always just going to be more things to explore and discover when you're just exploring the blue links and tabs. So just keep that in mind. And then finally, in the upper right, you'll see links for advanced settings where you can look at more indicators beyond those that are kind of default when you go to this tool. And then you can also go to the LEHD, the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics webpage, to learn more about this tool, the methodology. You can also look up other resources like the J2J Explorer tool, on the map application, and more, including contact information for those through the Census Bureau. And then I just have a couple of slides here because I wasn't going to transition to the web browser. We can look at, again, the little drop-down menu snapshot, the screenshot on the left, looking at just a flavor of those indicators that you can look into. So just some really in-depth indicators from, again, hiring, turnover, separations, employment counts, either at the beginning of the quarter, the end of the quarter, or stable employment counts. And then if you were to scroll down, you could see that there's actually quite a bit for earnings data too. And then on the right, you can see just some of those characteristics from the group drop-down menu. And then finally, if I'm going forward a little bit more, the last two screenshots I have for you here today, I talked about it already, but just a quick look at, if you're looking at those filters and aggregations for the industry sectors. So if you're clicking on that blue link for industries, this is where you can do the drop-down in there for the NAICS sectors at the top and go to the 3-digit or 4-digit. So one of the great things about this is you can zoom in on like a local industry. So still plugs here for the QWI Explorer before we get to the analysis. But you can look into things like construction or manufacturing or healthcare and social assistance. Just a couple of examples to see how those industries may be aging more rapidly or not as rapidly, or maybe becoming more diverse or not as diverse as other industries, or by gender and educational attainment. And then on the right, finally, you can look at specific geographies that I've already mentioned. So that's just a little bit about what is this data that we're talking about? Where is it coming from? How can we find this data, navigate the Quarterly Workforce Indicators tool, and come up with answers to those quick questions about aging or diversification, or come up with answers to those bigger questions about how does aging fit in within larger trends in the economy and the labor force? When it comes to things like tight labor market conditions with low unemployment or really high numbers of job postings, when it comes to challenges that employers are running into with labor availability. How are we going to attract and retain workers in today's labor markets when we are running into that really big challenge of not being able to find the talent that we need for these postings that we have? So we can start to look into things like labor force participation rates by different age cohorts using additional data from resources like the American Community Survey or the Current Population Survey. We can start to look into other trends along with this data from like the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So there's just a lot that you can do using this quarterly workforce indicators data to fit into those smaller and larger stories, those trends that we're seeing in this case across Minnesota, or in your case, whatever state or local area that you're living in, or in that broader picture, the United States. So this is just that quick snapshot then. I apologize. I think that you can see my face when I'm talking here, but once in a while, I'll be looking down at my horrible notes here, my horrible handwriting, just to get the specifics down. But this is that first look at what are we seeing here for aging in the state of Minnesota. So this is kind of that quick first visualization. It's just really eye-opening to see when you're looking at these different age cohorts, in this case for the state of Minnesota. So scrolling along the bottom of the screen, you can see that we're going from 14 to 24 years of age. Of course, most of those workers will be 16 years of age and older. In the QWI Explorer tool, you can actually break that down. I think it's 14 to 18, 19 to 21, and 22 to 24. And then you can go across the board, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, all the way through 65 years of age and older. So we're looking at this for the state of Minnesota between 1995 and 2020. And you can see just visually, looking at the far to right age cohorts, 55 to 64 years of age, and then 65 years of age and older, that these are showing significant increases in the number of older workers in the state of Minnesota. So the big takeaway, if I was to summarize everything about this report that I wrote about a year ago for the state of Minnesota, it's that Minnesota's workforce is becoming increasingly older. And as Erlene said in the introduction, I'm just going to repeat it here because it's kind of the main takeaway. This trend will continue to be seen as the baby boomer generation continues to age, and as labor force participation rates for older workers continue to creep up, that we're seeing, for instance, in American Community Survey data. Unless there's an increase in immigration or an unlikely increase in birth rates. So if we're looking at the specifics then, for instance, with those that are 55 years of age and older in the state of Minnesota in 1995, at that time, those older workers made up about 1 in 10 jobs, held about 1 in 10 jobs in the state of Minnesota, specifically at 10.6%. That increased to 15.1% in 2005. It increased to 21.9%. So we're already over holding 1 in 5 jobs in the state of Minnesota for these older workers in 2015. And then we're approaching now 1 in 4 workers, 1 in 4 jobs in the state of Minnesota being held by older workers, those 55 years of age and older, in 2020. Specifically then, if we're going one more cohort to the right, we can look at 65 and older again, specifically going from holding 2.3% of Minnesota's total jobs in 1995 to 3.2% in 2005 to 4.8% in 2015 to 5.9% in 2020. So just a couple of more things about the slide again. Your screen's not frozen. One of the things that's really interesting to see is one example being those that are 45 to 54 years of age. We can see as the baby boomer generation has shifted into older age cohorts, how that age cohort, those holding jobs in the state of Minnesota between 45 and 54 increased significantly between 1995 and 2010, and then decreased significantly between 2010 and 2020. And then the last thing I'll say about this slide, it's also really eye-opening to look at that prime working age group. So this is that group that's between 25 years of age and 54 years of age, typically called the prime working age cohort because this is that age cohort that has the highest labor force participation rates in the United States, in the state of Minnesota, if you're looking at these labor force participation rates. So in the state of Minnesota, labor force participation for this age cohort, 25 to 54, it's typically above 90%. But yes, those that were 25 to 54 in the state of Minnesota held about 73% of jobs in 1995. That decreased to about 68% in 2010 and decreased further to about 63% in 2020. So it's just, again, really eye-opening to see visually the decreases for those workers, those younger workers, 14 to 24, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, the decrease in overall the prime working age group, 25 to 54, And then finally, what this whole research paper is all about, looking at aging for those 55 to 64 and 65 years of age and older. So we could probably be done with the whole presentation right now, but I've got a couple of more slides here looking at some of the specifics. In this next case, we're looking at more recent data. So again, I wrote this research report on Minnesota's aging workforce about a year ago. So there's, of course, newer data through the QWI Explorer tool. Specifically, we can go through the second quarter of 2022. So you're looking here at not annual averages anymore. We're now looking at every year for the second quarter of that year. So between 1995 and 2022, we can still very much see, in this case, Minnesota's workforce share by different age cohorts. And you can see that increase. I bolded those age cohorts that are older. So we can see the red line below, those that are 65 and older. And then the orange line that's bolded, those that are 55 to 64. The interesting takeaway here, going through the second quarter of 2022, if I was to summarize what we've seen most recently, is that we still have the same share of workers in the state of Minnesota, 23.8%, that are 55 years of age and older in the second quarter of 2022. So that was the same that we saw for annual 2020. The interesting thing here that you see, though, just visually looking at, for instance, the orange line, we see a slight decrease in the share of workers being 55 to 64, but then we see a slight increase in the share of workers being 65 years of age and older. So zooming in on that age cohort, 55 and older, we can see how even that's becoming slightly older, with a higher share of workers being 65 years of age and older. And then, of course, you can look at the other age trends here too, really just visually eye-opening to see the increase for those 45 to 54 through 2010, and then the decrease through 2022. And then this slide here, pretty much the same data, but then just looking at the number of jobs held by workers in each age cohort. So this is where I'm going to look at my notes for a couple of seconds here, just to give you a couple of those in the weeds statistics. So between 2019 and 2020, so a lot of this data, we are looking at COVID impacts on the labor market and just seeing those shifts for older workers, for younger workers in the state of Minnesota as COVID had a deep impact on workers across the economy and the labor market. So for instance, in Minnesota, between 2019 and 2020, total employment decreased at that time, looking at the second quarter data here, by 5.9%. We saw that those that were 65 years of age and older, total jobs held by those older workers decreased by 6.9%. So 5.9 for total of all, 6.9% for those older workers 65 and older. So we saw more older workers leaving the labor force, leaving jobs held than for the total of all. The interesting thing there too, though, is that we also did see younger workers, especially those 14 to 24, leaving the labor force during this time. And this could probably be attributed to those industries that were hardest hit during COVID, being industries like accommodation and food services, especially restaurants, certain areas of healthcare and social assistance, other services, certain areas of retail trade, that largely with that distribution of workers being younger workers. So we see ultimately then between 2019 and 2020, a larger share of younger workers dropping out of the labor force. But yes, a slightly larger share of also older workers. So we can see accelerated retirements showing up in some of this quarterly workforce indicators data. And then this is just some of those bullet points. I'll let you read those too on the left-hand side of the screen, pretty much saying what I was just talking about. And while you're looking at these bullet points and that fun pie chart, if we're looking at then more recently, now between 2020 and 2022, we see that total employment in the state of Minnesota increased by 2.9% during that time. Those jobs held by older workers, 65 years of age and older, increased by 13%. So we're seeing older workers actually coming back into the labor market and looking to participate in the labor market. So it's a pretty eye-opening thing where we did see increased retirements, increased number of older workers leaving the labor market with COVID, but we're still seeing more recently older workers coming back into the labor market. So it's pretty eye-opening to see these trends through the second quarter of 2022. And just when you're looking at 2019 pre-COVID levels to 2022, the most up-to-date information we have, those that were 65 years of age and older in the state of Minnesota had the most significant increase for jobs held out of all the age cohorts, with many of those other age cohorts, those younger age cohorts, actually still looking to fully recover the share of total jobs held that they had in 2019 through today. So if I shift forward, you won't have too much time to look at it, but here's the second quarter 2019 pie chart, second quarter 2020 pie chart. Not much change there, but then if we go to the second quarter of 2022, as I just did, you do see that pretty sizable jump in the share of older workers in the state of Minnesota, jumping from, going back one, about 5.8% to 6.4%. So the story remains the same. If I was to summarize everything that I talked about through 2020 and now through 2022, the story remains the same, where we still yet see an aging workforce in the state of Minnesota. So why is this a big deal? I'm just going to break away before I get to the comparative kind of look at other states in the nation. This is where we can have, again, those conversations about tight labor markets. And I'm sure if you're in other states listening in today that you are also dealing with very tight labor markets. This is something that's being felt throughout the nation. This is data coming from the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, or JOLTS. There's just a lot of motion in the labor market, and this is just showing some of that motion, a kind of a snapshot of that motion that we're seeing with just the high number of job openings in the state of Minnesota, about 200,000. And then comparing that to the number of unemployed persons, which we are seeing some stabilization for unemployment in the state of Minnesota. It's been going up just a little bit in recent months, but we did hit record lows in the spring and summer months of 2022. Creeping up a little bit in 2023, and as well as seeing some of those job posting, those record numbers decreasing a little bit. So we are seeing some stabilization with tight labor markets, but still it remains where we have about 0.4 unemployed persons for every job posting in the state of Minnesota. And so when we have older workers that may be retiring now or are planning to retire soon, we have about a quarter of total jobs held by those that are 55 years of age and older. So these are workers that if they do decide, they can start hitting those retirement plans. So yes, this is very much why it's a big deal when we're looking into these aging trends for both the population and the workforce in the state of Minnesota and the United States. Another thing that you can look into then is this slide. So this slide, the orange line here, the top line is looking at the labor force participation rate overall for the state of Minnesota. And that's where you can see, and it's probably similar for many of your states and for the United States overall, where we had this large baby boomer generation, again, born between 46 and 64, moving into those prime working age, those years. And then that's leading to that peak labor force participation rate for Minnesota at over 75% at the turn of the millennium, as well as at that same time having women enter the labor market at accelerated rates. And now we're seeing that decrease since 2000. And with the whiplash of COVID-19 for labor force participation, that's really impacting then that blue line that you see in this slide here. And that's looking at the total labor force size in the state of Minnesota. And if you can do some quick calculations there, you'll see that between pre-COVID levels and currently, there's about 48,000 less unemployed, less persons in Minnesota's labor force today than there was pre-COVID. So again, thinking about older workers, what are the trends happening with older workers? What's happening with retirement? Are older workers coming back? If they are coming back, are they coming back on a full-time basis or a part-time basis? Are they looking for remote work options or telework options, more flexible schedules? And all that kind of stuff. This is somewhat related data that I'm switching to now, kind of the last slide on this related data before we get back to the QWI data. But this is data from the American Community Survey. Another great census information to look into. I'm sure many of you are well aware of this data. If you're not, check it out. But this is looking at generations in the workforce in the state of Minnesota. A little funky because we're looking at 5-year estimates, but still getting that main takeaway of how is the population breakdown by different generations for the dark blue columns kind of in the middle there. And then the lighter blue columns on the right of this table looking at those generations in the labor force. So we can look at just the total number in the labor force, looking at the percent of the labor force, and then looking at labor force participation rates. So kind of the big things that I see here for the state of Minnesota is that Generation X is now the largest cohort in our labor force, followed very closely by millennial generation, with Generation Z becoming more and more a part of the labor force. And then it'll be some time yet before Generation Alpha, I guess is what we're calling it, comes into the labor force. But keeping an eye on that baby boomer generation. And of course, those that are older, 76 and older, being part of the silent and greatest generations, and how these sections of the labor force in Minnesota are becoming smaller and smaller each year, and taking a look at labor force participation rates there. So it's just combining all this data from the Census Bureau, whether it's the American Community Survey or quarterly workforce indicators, combining with JOLTS data or QCW industry data. It's just, again, really eye-opening to see all these trends swirling around, and then having those conversations around hiring, around what are different generations looking for with work. Again, flexibility and remote work, transportation, housing, childcare, all this swirls together when you're looking into data like this. But getting back to the main point, Minnesota's workforce is aging with time. How does that compare to the United States and other states? So this is just a quick look at the blue lines being here in Minnesota for those 55 to 64 and 65 and older. And then the red lines being for the United States. And this is going back to that annual data I used for my research last year, going through 2020. And you can largely see that Minnesota does mirror the United States when it comes to an aging workforce. In actuality, if you're being really specific, slightly below actually the United States for an aging workforce. So if I was just to give you the specifics quickly, for those 55 years of age and older in the United States, went from about 10.4%, so very similar to Minnesota's in 1995, to 15.2%. So this is 55 and older, making up total jobs held. So 15.2% in 2005, 18.7% in 2010, 21.2% in 2015, and now at 23.6% in 2020. And then finally, we can start to look at specific state data and comparing Minnesota, which I bolded here, to other states. And this table is looking at, it's kind of funky, but this table is looking at states that are either geographically close to Minnesota, so geographic proximity, or have very similar employment levels. And then I just averaged them at the very bottom there. So it is a kind of a funky analysis here with this one table, but I just wanted to get a look at those states that are either close to Minnesota or close in terms of employment to Minnesota. So you can see that overall Minnesota does have a slightly faster increase than the average for jobs held by workers 55 and older between 2005 and 2020. If you're looking at that far right column, you can see that in Minnesota, total jobs between 2005 and 2020 increased by 5.7%. This, of course, is starting to look at those COVID impacts too. But then you can see the jobs held by older workers increased by 66% during that same period of time. A little bit higher than that 62.4% for the average of these states put together. The states with the largest share of workers 65 and older that are within this kind of analysis, Montana, South Dakota, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And then those states with smaller shares of older workers being Colorado, North Dakota, Tennessee, and Arizona. So it's just kind of eye-opening, and it kind of brings that greater level of understanding when you're looking at this data for your local state, I guess that makes sense, or your local area, zooming in on the counties that you can do with this QWI data. And then finally, I keep saying finally, it's like the end of Lord of the Rings here, but a couple more finallys here. You can also look at this data by all the states, of course. So we're zooming past, looking at those states that are geographically close or employment-wise close to Minnesota. And now we're just listing all the states that are available within the QWI Explorer tool. And so we're looking at the blue columns here being 2020 employment data. Of course, we can look again through the second quarter of 2022. but we can see the total jobs, it's sorted by total jobs. And then jobs held by workers 55 and older, jobs held by workers 65 and older. And then the lighter columns on the far right, looking at the trends over time, 2005 to 2020. So it is a little bit interesting when you're looking at, in this case, 15 years of trends for total employment change in jobs held by workers 55 and older. But you can start to look into that with other trends as well. So I would imagine it would be really eye-opening to look into maybe how trends changed with the Great Recession between 2007, 2008, 2009. That could be something, for instance, looking into just a couple of examples like manufacturing. You can see where maybe older workers were leaving manufacturing during that time, and then it was impacted even further after the Great Recession, where younger workers may have held off going into that industry sector. So that's a type of analysis that you can do with this, looking at those types of time periods. Or you can look into, of course, more recent data with COVID-19 and how that impacted aging in different industries as well. But yeah, I was getting a little ahead of myself with industry sectors. We can look at the states here, and then here's just the second half of those states here that you can look into. And I'll just kind of summarize here, looking at my notes, states with the largest proportional increases in older workers between 2005 and 2020 included Utah, Texas, Colorado, Idaho, North Dakota, Washington, and Arizona. And then the smallest proportional increases in older workers during this period of time being West Virginia, Connecticut, Nevada, Ohio, and Illinois. But in almost every case, you can see, I think it is every case, you can see that jobs held by workers 55 and older workers, increased significantly faster than just total employment growth for all of these states. And in many cases, some of these states might have actually seen their total employment drop between 2005 and 2020, but at the same time, the share of jobs held by older workers increased in those states as well. So my timer did go off, you might have heard that, so I'll conclude here with the last finalies of the finalies. This is again with the QWI data, as well as this is our QED data through DEED. You can look at aging by different industries, seeing how industries like transportation and warehousing, real estate, rental and leasing, utilities, and public administration are considerably older than industries like accommodation and food services, construction, administrative and support services, and arts and recreation. I'm not going to get into the weeds too much, but you can look at with the QWI data then too, just giving you a little teaser of how you might be able to use this for analysis, looking at the changes, the orange bars showing the losses for older workers, the share of jobs held between 2019 and 2020, the blue bars showing the change then more recently between 2020 and 2022. And then one more teaser, just showing total number of jobs changed, jobs held by older workers. This is for the state of Minnesota for different industry sectors. And then one more teaser, I kind of talked about it already, but you can look at specific industries like manufacturing. So we can look at earnings that you can see on the far right, the green column looking at a longer term trend, 2012 to 2022, the blue, light blue showing the more recent trends, 2019 to 2022. And in this case, in both time periods, if you're scrolling down your eyes to those 55 to 64, and especially 65 and older, we can see for manufacturing in Minnesota, the most significant increases in jobs held by older workers. So I think I'll end there. I did throw in some slides on Minnesota's aging population. Just it's important to throw in census data, population data, along with that workforce data that you get through the quarterly Workforce Explorer tool. So you can look at that population data here. Kind of the similar story of it's an aging population. And then you can also look into, through the presentation description, a couple of notes on immigration, on birth rates, things like that. So you can also get that through the Census Bureau Population Estimates Program. You can look at averages over the past decade and comparing it to more recent data through 2021 and now 2022, I believe. International immigration patterns, domestic migration patterns, and you can look at how births and deaths have changed over recent years, especially with COVID-19. And then just how aging, again, with the quarterly workforce indicators, those trends, it's going to just be more and more important to realize how these trends impact life and work, society, the economy, the labor force across the state of Minnesota, across all other states and the United States. The last thing I'll mention, very, very last thing, and I'll go to the last screen here actually, just to like promise you that this is the last thing I'll mention. I did another recent presentation on Minnesota's diversifying workforce, and it's just, it's really eye-opening there as well to see, while we are becoming older for our workforce in the state of Minnesota, we're also becoming much more diverse. And this is happening throughout much of the United States as well. And one of the things that we see with these other populations, such as those reporting as Black or African American, or 2 or more races, or some other race, or Asian or other Pacific Islander, and then as well as those that are immigrants, international immigrants, especially coming into the United States or your local area, you'll see that average ages for these diverse populations, BIPOC populations, are considerably younger than, for instance, in Minnesota, looking at this, the native white population. So that's just something else to contribute to the study on aging populations. So I suppose I'll summarize everything here. It's a nice summary, actually, just right there in the title, Minnesota's Aging Workforce. Using this quarterly workforce indicators data, you can see that we've gone from about 1 in 10 jobs being held in 1995 by those workers 55 and older to now almost 1 in 4, about 23.8% of jobs being held by workers 55 and older, and how this will just impact and resonate today and going forward. So hopefully this gave you a little teaser, a little nice overview and understanding for Minnesota's situation with an aging workforce and how you might be able to use this QWI Explorer tool to dig into the data and see how your state or your local area is trending with this type of information too. So thank you very much. And I suppose I'll hand it back on to you, Erling. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. What perfect timing too. Before we get to the questions in the Q&A, the presentation will be accessible on the Census Academy website at census.gov/academy under the webinar tab. Lisa has added the link in the chat. Again, please type all your questions in the Q&A and keep your questions pertaining to the presentation. The chat has been disabled to our attendees. So the first question I have is, what would be optimal in terms of labor force growth to meet demand?
Optimal in terms of labor force growth, I suppose, you want to get to that point in labor force growth. In the state of Minnesota, for instance, we saw that there's about 0.4 unemployed persons for every job opening. So you would ideally want to see that go to more of a 1-to-1 ratio. So to get to that, you'd like to see that labor force growth matching that hiring demand that we've got. And so I can't come with the specifics off the top of my head right now, but yes, just looking into higher birth rates, looking into higher labor force participation, how can we turn those trends around? We are starting to see that somewhat with older labor force participation rates creeping up in recent years. We also have a trends article that looks more in depth at this, written by my colleague, Anthony Schaffhauser. So that would be a great thing to look into for that if you're so inclined to learn more about Minnesota's labor force participation rate trends. But yes, there's a lot you can dig into there with labor force growth versus demand. And I think ultimately right now in the state of Minnesota, with things the way they are, with an aging workforce, with the really tight labor market conditions, a lot of emphasis, a lot of work, endeavors are being put into how can we reach those populations that are running into employment barriers and employment disparities, that have higher unemployment rates, that have lower labor force participation rates, whether that's BIPOC populations, those with reported disabilities, veterans, older workers too, and younger workers. And so that's the biggest thing that I see in the state of Minnesota right now as a labor market analyst through my kind of lens.
Okay, question number 2. Does Minnesota's workforce differ in any unexpected way from other states?
That's a good question. I can't remember the specifics looking at those that large data table. There's 50 states, so I'd encourage you to check out the report that I wrote to see how we might differ in those ways. One of the things that we've been really looking into, we just had my supervisor Cameron Macht wrote a report on Minnesota's Black labor force, and he just completed another one on Minnesota's Hispanic and Latino workforce, utilizing a lot of data from the quarterly workforce indicators tool. And I think one of the things that we're seeing in the state of Minnesota is a very rapidly diversifying population and workforce. And in fact, going back to the presentation I did previously for the LED partnership, Minnesota has one of the fastest, most significant diversifying workforces in the United States, especially when you're comparing it to similarly sized states. We're near the top, if not at the top, if you're comparing to similarly sized states in terms of total employment. So I think, yeah, one of the biggest things that I see is just we're becoming much more diverse in the state of Minnesota in terms of race and ethnicity.
Okay, the next question is, where do you get quarterly labor force participation rates and how much confidence do you have in them?
Yeah, so the quarterly labor force participation rates, I commonly, when I'm looking at there's pros and cons to all data tools. And so one of the pros, I get a lot of labor force participation rates from the American Community Survey. There's 1-year estimates, there's 5-year estimates. You can look at trends over time with those. And so the pro is that you can get down to those demographics. You can look at race and ethnicity, you can look at specific ages, you can look at disability status, so on and so forth. I suppose the con there would be that it's through 2021 currently. We can start to look into labor force participation through our local area unemployment statistics or our LAUS programs that you can find for all the states in the United States, as well as you can get some information as well through the current population survey, looking at labor force participation. The pros there, it's being more up to date. Some of the cons there though is that it will not get to that finer level of demographic data sometimes. So there's kind of a handoff when you're looking at some of these different data tools. And that's, you could have a lot of conversations there around the strengths and the weaknesses of each of those data tools. And that's why I think throughout my presentation here today, I was talking about using all these tools together to create that greater understanding. But if you want to reach out and learn more about how I'm grabbing more up-to-date labor force participation, definitely feel free to reach out. I kind of left the last page here for my contact information, our office, as well as finding more data through the QWI Explorer.
Question. Is age and sex data recorded in QCEW data on jobs? Excuse me, let me say that again. Is age and sex recorded in QCEW data on jobs?
If you're looking at quarterly census of employment and wage data, I think I'm understanding this question. Feel free to ask away again if I didn't, but every state's going to have that quarterly census of employment and wage data. And it's excellent data, it's powerful data. You can get a really great understanding for industry trends over time. The one thing though is that with QCW data, you're not going to get that demographic look. You're not going to be able to look at age and gender with strictly QCW data that you might get, for instance, through the state of Minnesota or other labor market information office websites and resources. That's where the power of QWI comes into play, where they're combining that QCW data with demographic data, for instance, through the American Community Survey. So we can get that finer look at looking at this industry data and then looking at it broken down by, in this case, your question was age and gender. With the state of Minnesota, we also have a unique partnership where we have, I showed one slide on it, but we have a similar tool called the Quarterly Employment Demographics, or QED, a lot of acronyms, data, where we're combining that QCW data with help from the Office of Public Safety looking at driver's license data. It doesn't get quite to the specificity and doesn't get to some of the demographics that we can with QWI. So there's definitely strengths and cons with both, with the QED as well. But I think it's really eye-opening to see that QED data as well for Minnesota, where we can look into gender and we can look into age.
There's a follow-up to that question. So it says, so the age and sex data by job is inferred, not directly observed. Is that correct?
Can you repeat that one more time?
So the age and sex data by job is inferred, not directly observed. Is that correct?
So yes. So if my understanding, yep, with the demographic data that we're grabbing from the census, it's based off of survey results, and then we're combining that with QCW data. So this is, yeah, I'm kind of getting a little confused in my head with the observed versus the inferred. But my suggestion would be to get a better understanding of how they're putting that information together. My suggestion would be to go to the QW Explorer tool, and in the upper right, it's got the help and documentation, and they've got some wonderful methodology on how they're putting this together. And I believe you'll get the best, most appropriate answer for that question there. I don't want to make stuff up, so.
And I'll go ahead and read the next question. Do you expect this trend of the 55 plus age group expanding to continue in the future? Won't baby boomers begin to retire in mass in the next few years as they turn 65, thereby decreasing their numbers?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I think, we're seeing an aging workforce. This is what we've seen for the last 25 years. If we're looking at these trends through QWI, through ACS, through population, we've got our Minnesota State Demographic Center that's showing us the same, of course. So this will continue as we're seeing this shift of all the generations of the baby boomer generation. But as you remarked, the baby boomer generation, a very large generation, will start to get older and older, and then these other generations will come up behind, looking at millennials, Gen Z, and I suppose it's Generation Alpha, I think. So it'll be really eye-opening to see if we'll become younger in following decades as the baby boomer generation ages, and as these other generations become larger. So yes, we'll continue to keep an eye on this. I'm sure the Census Bureau will, of course, and our Labor Market Information Office will continue to keep an eye on this, how aging continues to transform and continues to transform our workplaces.
Okay, the next question. How close is Minnesota to finding the natural rate of unemployment?
I think, yes, the natural rate of unemployment, I think that's kind of bringing up like presentations that I've done in the past in like 2017, 18, or 19. And if, I don't know, I'm guessing a lot of you probably didn't see me present then on Minnesota's unemployment. But I would present at that time, with Minnesota's unemployment rate around 3.5% to 4%, maybe around 4.5%. So somewhere between 3.5% to 4.5%, that was full employment. And then uncharted territory with COVID-19, we spiked at around 11% in Minnesota unemployment. But then we quickly went down to historic lows, hitting unemployment rate of 2.3% seasonally adjusted in the spring, summer months of 2022, which never seen unemployment that low. And a lot of states also hit record low unemployment rates in 2022. To the question, we're starting to see that stabilization then again of unemployment starting to creep back up. So going from 2.3% in Minnesota, we're now at a seasonally adjusted 3%. So we're starting to see, I think, that stabilization, as I mentioned before. We'll continue to keep an eye on. I'm not quite sure. Going to the specific question, I'm not a prognosticator. I'm not a part of our, even our projections team, although with our projections team, they're looking into with employment outlook. They're not looking into unemployment. But that would be a really interesting study to look into, seeing can we kind of get an idea of where unemployment might start to stabilize even more so. Is that going to be 3.5%? Are we going to get back up to around 4%? We'll continue to keep an eye on that local area unemployment statistics data. And that's going back to that earlier question on labor force participation rates too, keeping an eye on the stabilization, the trends of not only unemployment, but labor force participation. I think that's a huge thing when you're breaking it down as well by age, race, ethnicity, gender. And so that's another thing where my cohort in Northwest Minnesota, Anthony Schaffhauser, was looking into stabilization of labor force participation rates. So feel free to email me if you want that article.
Okay, the next question is, are not state participation rates based on really small samples quarterly?
There are some, yes. So that would be my other suggestion. I kind of mentioned it before. Looking into the methodology when I'm presenting on labor market data. I often talk about it's really important to know where this data is coming from. It's important to know what we're measuring. It's important to know if we're looking at like tables, charts, figures, graphs, like I did today in this presentation, what the axes are. So that's a great question talking about sample size. And that can be a point of concern for some surveys where we've got really small, like household surveys or business surveys. And the information that we're getting from these, can we glean, that rock solid understanding of what's actually happening today? So I think that's where looking at the trends over time is really important to see. You're getting that snapshot with a lot of surveys like that month or that quarter. And I think when you're looking at the longer term trends, with ACS, the 1 year versus the 5 year estimates, taking a look at those as well, seeing what are we getting the greater picture here. So that's where the reliability starts to come into play, I believe, when you're looking at some of those longer term trends, or when you're starting to combine different data sets. And are they saying the same thing? Are they saying different things? How are they working together? So yes, that's a great question though. And again, I would recommend looking into, every time you go to a labor market tool, looking into the documentation, the methodology sections to see how it's put together. Where's the data coming from? Any other questions, Lisa?
There's one more question. There's another question. North Carolina is seeing a similar change for the COVID impact, but not the reduction in older workers. That's rather a comment. There's another question after that. I believe it's the last question. That is the last comment.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to Tim for his excellent presentation. Tim, would you like to make any closing remarks?
I suppose I'll just, say that this is a really cool tool, the QWI Explorer tool. That was kind of what the study was all about, looking at Minnesota's aging workforce. And the questions here, I think, are just kind of reinforcing from what I heard from these questions, that this is just something that's going beyond the state of Minnesota too. It's affecting pretty much every state, the United States, with aging workforces, and looking into statistics like labor force participation and looking into statistics like unemployment rates. How can we get the demographics? How can we look at the trends over time? What's the reliability of surveys? How can we put all of this information together to get that greater understanding? And I think that's the point of looking into resources like through the LED partnership, through the Census Bureau, LEHD, C2ER, the LMI Institutes, and then each state's labor market information office, like we have here with the Department of Employment and Economic Development. So I think each of the tools, for instance, on their own, really cool stuff, but when you use them together, use them in concert with one another to create that greater understanding, that's where the power of this really comes through, and hopefully can lead to greater understanding and lead to some policies and some actions that can help out, in this case, Minnesotans, or in the broader case for each of your states, Americans overall, with being connected with those opportunities that are there for them, or for employers to find and retain those workers and continue to grow and be successful.
All right. Well, before we say goodbye, I just want to draw your attention to the link for a survey in the chat. And if you would please fill that out so we can better serve you. So please join us as our LED webinar series continues on May 17th. Until then, on behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thank you for spending your day with us.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for your participation. You may disconnect at this time.